Thanks, comrades. Thank you. For those of you who know my normal speaking style, can I just give you this warning? This is not going to be my usual rant, and there's no jokes. They get me into trouble. And I promised Jeremy I'd behave myself. Also, I have to say we've had some serious messages for the British people today as well. Jeremy and I sat down at the beginning of the campaign for the Labour leadership to discuss what they call the strapline for his campaign leaflets and posters. And we came up with the strapline you see now: straight talking, honest politics. It just embodied for me what Jeremy is all about. So in the spirit of straight talking and honest politics, here's some straight talking. At the heart of Jeremy's campaign, from which he was received such a huge mandate, was the rejection of austerity politics. But you know, austerity is just a word almost meaningless to many people. What does it actually mean? Well, for Michael O'Sullivan, austerity was more than a word. Michael suffered from severe mental illness. He was certified by his GP as unable to work, but despite the evidence submitted by 3 doctors, he was assessed by the company, given the contract for the work capability assessment, as fit for work. Michael killed himself after his benefits were removed. The coroner concluded that his death was a direct result of the decision in his case. And I don't think Michael's case is alone. I'm grateful to Michael's family for allowing me to mention him today, and I send them, and I'm sure on behalf of us all here, our heartfelt sympathy and condolences. But I also want them to know that this party, when we return to government, we will end this brutal treatment of disabled people. Austerity is also not just a word for the 100,000 children in homeless families who tonight will be going to bed not in a home of their own, but in a bed and breakfast or temporary accommodation. On behalf of this party, I give those children my solemn promise. When we return to government, we will build you all a decent and secure home in which to live. Austerity is not just a word for the women and families across this country being hit hardest by cuts to public services. Women still face an average 19% pay gap at work. I tell you now, Labour will tackle the pay gap, will oppose the cuts to our public services, and we will end discrimination in our society. Whenever we cite examples of what austerity really means, the Conservatives always argue that no matter what the social cost, their austerity policies, they are necessary to rescue our economy. Let's be clear. Austerity is not an economic necessity, it's a political choice. The leadership of the Conservative Party made a conscious decision 6 years ago that the very richest would be protected, and it wouldn't be those who caused the economic crisis who would pay for it. Although they said they were one nation Tories, they've demonstrated time and time again they don't represent one nation, they represent the 1%. The 1%. When we challenged their austerity programme, the Conservatives accused us of being deficit deniers. Let me make this absolutely clear. Of course, we accept that there is a deficit, but we'll take no lessons from a Chancellor who promised to wipe out the deficit in one Parliament but didn't get through half, who promised to pay down the debt but has increased it by 50% and more. I tell you straight, from here on in, Labour will always ensure that this country lives within its means. But we will tackle the deficit. But this is the dividing line between Labour and Conservative. Unlike them, we will not tackle the deficit on the backs of the middle and low earners, and especially not by attacking the poorest in our society. We've always prided ourselves on being a fair and compassionate people in this country, and we are. We will tackle the deficit fairly, and we can do it. And here's how. We will dynamically grow our economy. We will strategically invest in the key industries and sectors that will deliver the sustainable long-term economic growth that this country needs. Economic growth that will reach all sections, all regions and all nations of our country, and I mean it. I tell you now, I was devastated by the Labour losses in Scotland. But let's be clear, the SNP has now voted against the living wage, against capping rent levels, and just last week voted against fair taxes in Scotland to spend on schools. So here's my message to the people of Scotland. Labour is now the only anti-austerity party. And I tell you, for those in Scotland who want to campaign against austerity, now's the time to come home. Come home to Labour. We will halt the Conservative tax cuts to the wealthy, paid for by cuts to families' income. As Margaret has said, 3 weeks ago we sat in Parliament, we saw one of the starkest examples of the difference between us and the Conservatives. The Conservatives cut tax credits to working families to pay for a multi-billion-pound cut in inheritance tax. Families who've done everything asked of them, working hard but dependent on tax credits to make up for low pay. They'll have £1,300 taken from them to pay for the tax cuts to who? To the wealthiest 4% of our population. The Conservatives argued they'd introduced the living wage to make up for the tax credit cut. But we all know, as Margaret has said, it was neither a living wage nor, according to the IFS, did it make up for the amount families lost. I tell you now, when we return to office, we will introduce a real living wage to lift people out of poverty. Labour's plan to balance the books will be aggressive. We will force people like Starbucks, Vodafone, Amazon and Google and all the others to pay their share of taxes. Let me tell you also, there will be cuts to tackle the deficit. But our cuts will not be to the number of police officers on our streets, or nurses in our hospitals, nor teachers in our classrooms. There'll be cuts to the corporate welfare system that's grown up. There will be cuts to the subsidies paid to companies that take the money and fail to deliver the jobs. There'll be cuts to the use of taxpayers' money subsidising poverty-paying bosses. And there'll be cuts to the billion-pound tax breaks given to buy-to-let landlords for repairing their homes when they do not undertake the repairs. And we'll cut the housing benefit bill. Yes, we'll cut the housing benefit bill. And we'll do it by building the homes we need and controlling exorbitant rents. Where money needs to be raised, it will be raised from a fairer, more progressive taxation. If we inherit a deficit in 2020, fiscal policy will be used to pay down the debt and lower the deficit. but at a speed that does not put in jeopardy sustainable economic growth. We'll use active monetary policy to stimulate demand where necessary. But also now we'll turn the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills into a powerful economic development department in charge of public investment, infrastructure planning, and yes, setting new standards at work for all employees. This is a radical departure, not just from neoliberalism, but also from the way past administrations have tried to run our economy. Why? Well, to be frank, we just don't think the current model delivers. We don't think that destroying industries and then subsidizing low-pay economy through a tax system is a good idea. But our radicalism comes with a burden, and we have to acknowledge that. We need to prove to the British people we can run the economy better than the rich elite that runs it now. That's why today I've established an Economic Advisory Committee to advise us on the development and implementation of our economic strategy. We will draw upon the unchallengeable expertise of some of the world's leading economic thinkers, including Joseph Stiglitz, Professor Thomas Piketty, Professor Mariana Mazzucato, Simon Reid-Lewis, Anne Pettifer, and the former member of the Bank of England Monetary Committee, David Blanchflower. And you know there are many, many others that are being drawn in now for their specialist knowledge as we create our economic policies. And I give you this undertaking. Every policy we propose, every economic instrument we consider for use will be rigorously tested to its extreme before we introduce it in government. And we'll demand that the Office of Budget Responsibility and the Bank of England put their resources at our disposal to test and test and test again to demonstrate that our plans are workable and affordable. These bodies are paid for by taxpayers and therefore should be accessible to all parties that are represented in Parliament. In government, we will establish and abide that as a convention. The foundation stones of our economic policy are prosperity and social justice. We will create what Mariana Mazzucato describes as the entrepreneurial state, a strategic state which works in partnership with businesses, entrepreneurs and workers to stimulate growth. Government's role is to provide the opportunity for massive advances in technology, skills and organisational change that will drive up productivity, create new innovative projects and also new markets. That requires patient, long-term finance for investment in research from an effectively resourced and empowered national investment bank that we will create in government. A successful and fair economy cannot be created without the full involvement of its workforce. That's why restoring trade union rights and extending them to ensure workers are involved in determining the future of their companies is critical to securing the skills and the development and innovation to compete in a globalised economy. But we'll also promote modern, alternative, public, cooperative, worker-controlled and genuinely mutual forms of ownership across our economy. I'll watch my language on this one. Look, I found at this stage, let me just say, I found the Conservatives' rant against Jeremy's proposal to bring rail back into public ownership absolutely ironic when George Osborne was touring China, selling off to the Chinese State Bank any British asset he could lay his hands on. It seems, it seems the state nationalising our assets is okay with the Tories as long as it's Chinese State Bank, or in the case of the railways, the Dutch or the French. Institutional change will follow and has to reflect our policy change. So I want us to stand back and review the major institutions that are charged with managing our economy to check that they're fit for purpose and how they can be made more effective. So as a start, I've invited Lord Bob Kerslake, former head of the Civil Service, to bring together a team to review the operation of the Treasury itself. I'll also be setting up a... I thought that would go down well. I'll also be setting up a review of the Bank of England. Let me be clear, we will guarantee the independence of the Bank of England, but it's time, though, to open up the debate on the bank's mandate that was set by Parliament 18 years ago. The mandate focuses on inflation, and even then, the bank regularly fails to meet its target. We will launch a debate on expanding that mandate to include new objectives, including growth, employment and earnings as well. We'll review the operation and resourcing of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs to ensure that HMRC is capable of addressing tax evasion and avoidance and modernising our tax collection system. This is how we prepare for the future and the very day we go back into government. Let me just return now to today's economy because to be frank, I'm fearful for the future. George Osborne fought the last election on the myth that the slowest economic recovery from recession in a century has been some sort of economic success. In reality, the Tories presided over the longest fall in workers' pay since Queen Victoria sat on the throne. A recovery that was based upon rising housing prices, growing consumer credit and inadequate reform of the financial sector. An imbalanced economy overwhelmingly reliant on insecure jobs in the service sector. Our balance of payments deficit, it's the gap between what we earn from the rest of the world and what we pay to the rest of the world, is at its highest levels since modern records began. I just worry that many of the pre-crash warning signs are reappearing again. But the UK's economy is in recovery only despite the Chancellor's policies, not because of them. You know the narrative that George Osborne wanted to present of us this week. Deficit deniers risking the security of the nation, all that. It was so obvious, all of us could have written it blindfolded. He's brought forward his grandiose fiscal charter, not as a serious policy making, but as a political stunt, a trap for us to fall into. I just say to George, we're not playing these games anymore. We're more interested in the long-term future of our economy than this political spin that he's developing. I want you and I want the rest of this country to know the significance of what we're doing today. We're embarking upon the immense task of changing the economic discourse in this country, step by step. First, we're throwing off that ridiculous charge that we're deficit deniers. Second, we're saying tackling the deficit is important, but we're rejecting austerity as the means to do it. Third, we're setting out an alternative based on dynamically growing our economy, ending the tax cuts for the rich, and addressing the scourge of tax evasion and tax avoidance. Fourth, just having cleared all that debris from our path, we're opening up a national discussion on the reality of the roles of deficits, surpluses, long-term investment, debt and monetary policy. And we're involving the British people in this discussion. Fifth, we will develop a coherent, concrete alternative that grows a green, a sustainable and prosperous economy for everybody and not just the few. We're moving on the economic debate in this country from puerile knockabout to an adult conversation. I believe the British people are fed up with being patronised and talked down to by politicians with little more than silly slogans and misleading analogies. I tell you, this is an immense task. That's why we need to draw upon all the talents outside and inside the party. I admit I was disappointed after Jeremy's election that some people refused to serve. In the spirit of solidarity upon which our movement was founded, I say, come back and help us succeed. Come back. People will be encouraged to express their views in constructive debate. Do not mistake debate for division. Do not mistake democracy for disunity. This is the new politics. Many still don't understand its potential. But as socialists, we will display our competence with compassion. We're idealists, yes, but our idealism is pragmatic idealism, to get things done, and above all else, to transform our society. We remain inspired by the belief and the hope that, yes, in the words of the slogan, another world is possible. This is our opportunity to prove it. Let's seize it. Solidarity.